It's the night of September 16th, 1597, and you are standing on the deck of a Korean warship in a stretch of water called Myeongyang Strait. The air smells like salt and wet rope, and underneath it, something sharper. The tang of gunpowder that never quite washes out of a warship's timbers. The wood beneath your feet creaks with every roll of the current, and the current here doesn't behave like normal water. Every few hours, without warning, it reverses, the whole strait suddenly running backward, fast enough to spin a heavy ship sideways like a leaf. Local fishermen call this water cursed. Sailors who don't know it avoid it entirely. Yi Sun-sin knows every inch of it. Look around you at the fleet you're part of. Count the ships. 12, maybe 13. Even now, after everything, no one is entirely sure, because ships get lost, damaged, patched together out of wreckage, and record-keeping in the middle of a collapsing war isn't exactly tidy. Some of these hulls are cracked. Some of the sailors, standing at the oars, haven't slept in 2 days. This is not a proud fleet. This is what's left after almost everything else was destroyed. And somewhere beyond the black horizon, more than 130 Japanese warships are anchored, resting, waiting for morning, the spearhead of a much larger invasion force that numbers over 300 vessels in total. Thousands of soldiers, thousands of arquebuses, the deadly matchlock guns that have already burned their way through half of Korea. Admirals who have never once, in this entire war, met a Korean fleet they couldn't outnumber 10, 20, 30 times over. Tomorrow, these ships are going to sail directly into this strait. Somewhere in the darkness, you can hear men talking in low voices, not orders, just fear, passed quietly from sailor to sailor, the way fear always travels on a ship the night before a battle nobody thinks they can win. A few of them are whispering about slipping away before dawn. Who could blame them? Do the math. 13 ships, 130. This isn't a battle plan. It's a sentence. But there is one man on this fleet who is not afraid. His name is Yi Sun-sin, and by the time this night is over, you need to understand exactly what has already been taken from him. His own king has already had him arrested. His own government has already had him tortured, dragged into a chamber, and beaten on the orders of men who knew, deep down, that he had done nothing wrong. He has already been stripped of his rank, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times in his life. Thrown back into the ranks as a common soldier with no title at all, as though the 23 years he'd spent building himself into the finest naval commander in Asia had simply never happened. The navy he built with his own hands, ship by ship, sailor by sailor, the fleet he had bled for, was taken from him and handed to another man, who lost almost the entire thing in a single afternoon. He has buried people he loved during this war, and he is not finished burying people yet. He has every reason in the world to be a bitter man. He has every reason tonight to slip his own ship quietly out of this strait and let Korea's fate be someone else's problem for once. Instead, that night, in a small leather-bound diary he has kept almost every single day of this war, a diary that still exists today, that historians can still read in his own handwriting, 400 years later, Yi Sun-sin wrote 9 words that Korean schoolchildren still memorize. A man determined to die will live. A man determined to live will die. Sit with that for a second. He wasn't writing poetry for the history books. He was talking to himself and to the terrified sailors around him on the worst night of an already unbearable war. He was saying, the moment you decide your only goal is to survive tomorrow, you have already lost tomorrow. The only way through that strait, against those odds, is to stop bargaining with fear and simply do the job in front of you. Tomorrow morning, this man is going to sail 13 broken ships, directly at a fleet more than 10 times its size, and by sunset, one of the most lopsided naval catastrophes in the history of warfare is not going to happen to Korea. It is going to happen to Japan. But to understand how anyone ends up here, calm, sleepless, betrayed by his own government, and still willing to die defending it, we can't start on this ship. We have to go back, not just a few years before this night. We have to go all the way back to a boy in Seoul who, by every expectation placed on him at birth, was never supposed to become a soldier at all. A kingdom of scholars, an island of swords. Here's a question worth asking before we go any further. What does it take to build a nation that can win a war like this one? Not just brave soldiers, not just clever admirals. It takes something underneath all of that, the shape of the whole society, built up quietly over generations, long before anyone knows a war is coming. And in the late 1500s, two very different societies were about to collide, and almost nobody in either one of them understood just how differently they had each been built. Let's start with Korea. For 200 years, the Korean peninsula had lived under the Joseon dynasty, a kingdom that measured its own success not by conquest, but by order. Joseon Korea was built on the philosophy of a Chinese thinker named Confucius, who taught that a good society ran on respect, respect for your parents, respect for scholars, respect for the wisdom of the past, respect for your place in a very carefully arranged hierarchy. If you wanted power in Joseon Korea, you didn't pick up a sword, you picked up a brush. Every noble family in Korea dreamed of the same thing for their sons: pass the civil service examination, a grueling, years-long test of classical poetry, philosophy, and law, and join the ranks of the royal court in the capital city of Seoul. That was success. That was the finish line every noble child was raised to run toward. In Joseon Korea, a career in the military carried a kind of quiet social embarrassment for noble families. If your son became a great scholar official, you had raised him right. If your son became a soldier instead, some of your neighbors might wonder, politely, what had gone wrong. That doesn't mean Korea had no army at all. Up along the northern border, fierce mounted raiders from Jurchen tribes crossed in from time to loot villages and vanish back into the wilderness. Down along the southern coastline, pirate ships would occasionally strike a fishing town and disappear before help arrived. Korea built forts for these threats, simple stone walls, usually set on hilltops, meant to give villagers somewhere to hide until the raiders lost interest and left. But 200 years of relative peace does something to a country's military, even when nobody notices it happening. Budgets get cut a little every year. Muster rolls, the official lists of men obligated to serve, get old and inaccurate, so nobody actually knows how many soldiers they can really call up. Corrupt officers learn that a border post is a place to collect a salary quietly, not a place to actually prepare for war. By the late 1500s, Korea's military existed mostly on paper. It looked strong from a distance. Up close, in the forts nobody powerful ever visited, it was hollow. Now picture the opposite of all that, sitting just across the water. Japan had just spent an entire century tearing itself apart. Historians call it the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, 100 years in which regional warlords called daimyo fought each other, province by province, castle by castle, in an unbroken chain of civil wars. And out of a century of non-stop bloodshed, Japan had built something Korea simply hadn't: veteran armies, hundreds of thousands of men strong, led by generals who had personally survived dozens of real battles rather than studying old ones in a book. Japan's daimyo had become some of the most enthusiastic adopters of a brand new European weapon, the arquebus, an early type of matchlock firearm. Japanese gunsmiths didn't just copy it, they mass-produced it, refined it, and developed coordinated volley fire tactics, where ranks of gunners took turns firing and reloading, so an advancing enemy faced what felt like an unbroken wall of gunfire. By the time this invasion force finally sailed for Korea, roughly one soldier in every 4 would be carrying one of these guns. They had also become master besiegers. Decades of having to storm each other's elaborate mountain castles had taught Japanese armies how to break through fortifications that would have stopped almost anyone else. And by 1590, for the first time in Japanese history, all of that terrifying battle-tested military power had been unified under a single ruler. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He wasn't born into nobility. He was born a peasant, a fact almost unheard of for someone who would eventually rule all of Japan. And he had clawed his way, battle by battle and alliance by alliance, to the top of the entire warrior class that had spent 100 years fighting itself. And Hideyoshi looked at what he had built, the largest, most experienced army in Asia, and decided it wasn't enough to simply rule Japan. He wanted an empire, and Korea sat directly in his path to get one. 2 nations, One had spent 2 centuries mastering the quiet, careful art of peace. The other had spent a century mastering the loud, brutal art of war. Neither one fully understood what the other had become. But before we watch these 2 worlds collide, we need to meet the one man standing between them, and he starts this story as the very last person anyone expected to end up wearing armor. Yi Sun-sin was born in 1545 in Seoul into a family of scholars. Not warriors, not generals, scholars, a family that generations earlier had produced respected officials in the royal court and that expected its sons to keep walking that same well-worn path. So that's exactly how young Yi Sun-sin was raised. Confucian philosophy, classical poetry, the dense, demanding texts that every noble boy in Korea memorized in preparation for the civil service exam, the test that would, if he passed it, open the door to a comfortable, respected life inside the royal court, surrounded by books and politics and the quiet, orderly rhythms of Seoul. That was the plan everyone had for him. It was not the plan he had for himself. Somewhere inside that studious, book-filled childhood, something else had quietly taken root. While the other boys around him imagined themselves debating philosophy in front of the king, Yi Sun-sin imagined himself commanding soldiers. He studied archery. He studied strategy. He asked questions about weapons and tactics that made the adults around him a little uncomfortable, because those weren't questions a future court scholar was supposed to be asking. As a boy, Yi Sun-sin was known to organize other children into mock battles, dividing them into armies and directing their play fighting with real strategic thinking, the kind of thing that decades later people would look back on and call an obvious sign of what he'd become. At the time, it probably just looked like an unusual boy who liked pretending to be a general a bit too much. Here's what makes this choice matter so much. In Yi Sun-sin's world, choosing the military over the civil service wasn't just an unusual hobby. It was, in the eyes of his own social class, something close to a step down. Nobles competed with words and rank and poetry in the royal court. They didn't drill in the mud with a spear. Yi Sun-sin didn't care. As he grew older, he made a decision that would define the entire rest of his life. A decision his family almost certainly didn't celebrate the way they would have celebrated a civil service pass. Instead of the traditional exam that led to a court position, Yi Sun-sin chose the military examination. He was choosing the harder path, the less respected path, the path his own society quietly looked down on. He had absolutely no idea, yet, just how many times that decision was about to nearly break him, or how many times, decades later, it would end up being the only thing standing between his country and total destruction. The year is 1572. Yi Sun-sin is 28 years old, and after years of preparation, he is finally standing on the field, ready to take the military examination he has wanted his entire life. Picture it with me. An open plain outside the city, dust rising with every hoofbeat. Rows of stern-faced military officials seated along the edge of the field, evaluating every candidate on archery, horsemanship, and combat skill. One of the required events demands that candidates ride hard across open ground at full gallop while performing archery and weapons maneuvers from horseback. A brutal test not just of physical skill, but of nerve, because one mistake at that speed can end a career or a life. Yi Sun-sin rides out onto the field, and his horse stumbles. He is thrown from the saddle at speed, and he hits the ground hard, in full view of every official who will decide whether he passes this exam. For a moment, a real breath-holding moment, the men watching think he might actually be dead. He isn't, but when he tries to push himself up, his leg gives out beneath him. It's broken, not a hairline crack, broken badly enough that anyone watching could see the bone had shifted, twisted at an angle a leg was never meant to bend. Now stop for a second and really imagine this. You've spent years preparing for this single day. Your whole future, the whole direction of your life, depends on what happens on this field. And in the middle of it, you're lying in the dirt with a shattered leg, and everyone around you has already decided your exam, maybe your entire future, just ended. What would you do? Yi Sun-sin got up. Dragging his broken leg behind him through the dirt, he pulled himself across the field to a nearby willow tree. And there, with no doctor, no medicine, nothing but his own hands and whatever the tree could give him, he tore off strips of bark and green branches and splinted his own leg, right there on the ground, in front of everyone. Then he dragged himself back to his horse, and he remounted it, and he finished the examination, and his official result was a failure. Read that again if you need to. After everything, the fall, the broken bone, the self-made splint, finishing the exam on a shattered leg out of sheer will, Yi Sun-sin still failed. Most people would have taken that as the world sending them a message. Most people, 28 years old, with a leg that would take months to heal, might have quietly gone back to the path their family had wanted for them all along. Yi Sun-sin didn't. 4 years later, in 1576, at 32 years old, older than almost every other candidate standing beside him, Yi Sun-sin took the military examination again. This time he passed. Before Yi Sun-sin ever commanded a single soldier, before he had ever fought in a single battle on land or sea, this one moment, a shattered leg, a willow tree, and a stubborn refusal to be finished, already told the world everything it needed to know about the kind of man he was. Because here's the pattern this story is about to repeat, again and again, for the next 22 years of his life. The world is going to knock this man down, hard, over and over, in ways that would break almost anyone else. And every single time, he is going to splint the wound himself, get back up, and keep going. What happened next for Yi Sun-sin, though, wasn't glory. It wasn't a rapid rise to fame and command. It was 22 years of being punished for being good at his job. I want to warn you before we start this chapter, it's going to make you angry. It should. Because what happened to Yi Sun-sin over the next 2 decades is one of the most unjust professional histories of any great commander in world history. And almost every single piece of it happened for the exact same reason. Not because he made mistakes, not because he was incompetent, because he refused to be corrupt inside a system that ran on corruption, and that system punished him for it, over and over and over. Let's walk through it piece by piece, because every piece matters. The Northern Fort. After finally passing the military exam, Yi Sun-sin's first posting sent him to a remote, half-forgotten fort along Korea's northern frontier. This wasn't a reward. Postings like this were where officials sent people they wanted to quietly forget about. Men who had fallen out of favor, or who simply didn't have anyone powerful enough in Seoul to get them somewhere better. Most commanders treated a posting like this as a punishment to endure, not a job to actually do. Yi Sun-sin refused to see it that way. He drilled his soldiers relentlessly, day after day, in conditions most officers wouldn't have bothered with. He personally oversaw repairs to crumbling walls and neglected defenses. Within a relatively short time, he had turned a forgotten, half-abandoned outpost into a genuinely fortified position, ready, for the first time in years, for an actual attack. One day, the provincial governor arrived to inspect the border forts, a man every commander in the region dreaded, known across the province for harsh discipline and merciless, unforgiving inspections. Fort after fort, he found something to criticize. When he reached Yi Sun-sin's post, he looked around at the drilled soldiers, the repaired walls, the fort standing ready in a way none of the others had been, and he simply said, "Well done." 2 words, no medal, no ceremony, just 2 words from a man who almost never said them to anyone. But it was enough. Men who impressed people like that got noticed, and men who got noticed in Joseon, Korea got transferred. The military academy, and the first real enemy. Yi Sun-sin was recalled to Seoul and given a teaching post at the military academy, training the next generation of recruits. On paper, this should have been an honor. A rising star being brought back to the capital to shape the future of the army. In practice, it was a trap. The academy, quietly, had become a machine for corruption. Powerful families used it to fast-track their sons through the ranks without earning a single promotion, honestly. Court officials used it to funnel their favorite candidates into the most comfortable postings, in exchange for favors owed and favors returned. Yi Sun-sin looked at that system and refused to participate in it. He graded honestly, he trained rigorously, he would not wave a well-connected noble's son through simply because of whose family he belonged to. This made him popular with exactly nobody who had power in that system. Before long, he was quietly pushed back out of Seoul, sent right back to the provinces, punished in effect for the crime of doing his job with integrity, rising again, and the first betrayal. By that summer, Yi Sun-sin had secured a naval garrison command, and once again, he began climbing quickly through the ranks. But jealous officials had already started scheming against him almost immediately, man after man attempting to have him quietly removed on manufactured charges. Yi Sun-sin fought off every single attempt, until finally one attempt succeeded. A former superior from his time at the military academy, one of the very men Yi Sun-sin had rebuked years earlier for corruption, was sent to inspect his province. Seeing an opportunity for revenge that had been years in the making, the man wrote a report back to the capital, accusing Yi Sun-sin of complete negligence of duty. It was a lie, invented out of nothing but spite. But a well-placed lie, sent to the right desk in Seoul, is a powerful thing. Yi Sun-sin was dismissed from the military entirely. 4 months later, a full investigation cleared him completely. He hadn't been negligent at all. Everyone in the capital who bothered to look at the facts knew it. But here's the injustice worth sitting with. Even after being formally proven innocent, Yi Sun-sin wasn't simply restored to the position he'd been unfairly torn away from. He was returned to service at the lowest possible officer rank the military had, nearly starting over from nothing, because he had told an inconvenient truth to a man with more power than he had. The Tumen River ambush. Eventually, an old rival who had come to respect him, one of the fleet commanders Yi Sun-sin had once served under, requested that he be transferred north to help defend the frontier, where Jurchen raiders had been rampaging almost unopposed. Yi Sun-sin was given a fort to command along the Tumen River, one of the tense borderlines between Korean and Jurchen territory. He drilled his troops until they were sharp, and then he made a bold decision. Rather than simply hunkering down and waiting behind walls for the next raid, he laid his men in ambush and deliberately lured a raiding party deep into Korean territory before springing the trap shut around them. The ambush was devastating. Within hours, Yi Sun-sin's forces had smashed the raiders with a speed and ferocity the Jurchen tribes had never before experienced from a Korean commander. Their power in the region was broken. They would not seriously threaten that border again for years. The court in Seoul was thrilled by the news of this victory. And then, nothing happened. A jealous official at court quietly blocked any formal reward or promotion for the man who had just delivered the most decisive victory that border had seen in a generation. Mourning and a crumbling island fortress. Not long after, Yi Sun-sin's father died, deeply devoted to Confucian tradition, the very tradition that had originally wanted him to be a scholar instead of a soldier. Yi Sun-sin stepped away from active military service entirely for 3 full years, the customary mourning period expected of a devoted son, even though it meant pausing the career he had fought so hard to build. When he finally returned to duty, he was briefly assigned to oversee court transportation, a minor administrative post that had nothing to do with his real skills, before being urgently reassigned to the northern frontier just 16 days later. This time, his post was a small island fortress, undermanned, crumbling, barely defensible at all. Once again, Yi Sun-sin drilled the tiny garrison and did what he could to shore up the defenses. Week after week, he sent formal, urgent requests up the chain of command asking for reinforcements. Week after week, those requests were ignored. Imagine you are there. You're standing watch on the wall of a crumbling frontier fort. It's early morning, and a thick mist has rolled in off the surrounding hills, so heavy you can barely make out the tree line 50 paces away. Most of the garrison isn't even inside the walls this morning. The military's supply system out here is so badly broken that soldiers on this border have to leave the fort and harvest their own rice just to have something to eat, so the walls around you are nearly empty. Just you, a dozen other soldiers, and Yi Sun-sin. Then, out of the mist, you hear it. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming fast. Jurchen raiders are pouring out of the fog on horseback, faster than anyone had time to prepare for. There's no time to call the men back in from the fields. There's no reinforcement coming. There never was. No matter how many letters were sent. Yi Sun-sin has barely a dozen soldiers standing beside him against an entire raiding force. Now think about what most commanders would do in that moment. Pull back, barricade what's left. try to survive until the raiders lose interest and leave. The way Korea's coastal forts had always been designed to handle threats like this. Yi Sun-sin didn't do that. He and his small handful of men fought their way directly toward a group of Korean civilians the raiders had already captured, cutting a path through chaos and violence to reach 50 people who would otherwise have been dragged away as prisoners, sold, or worse. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they got all 50 of those people free. Now imagine the part that should have come next. You survived an overwhelming attack. You saved 50 innocent lives with only a dozen soldiers. You should be celebrated as a hero. Instead, Yi Sun-sin's superior officer, a man named Yi Il, terrified of taking blame for a disaster caused by his own refusal to send reinforcements, reported to the capital that the entire defeat was Yi Sun-sin's fault. Yi Sun-sin was arrested, dragged back to the capital, and tortured, a standard brutal practice used in Joseon-era trials to extract confessions from the accused. He did not break. He would not confess to a failure that had never been his in the first place. When it finally came time for him to speak in his own defense, Yi Sun-sin looked directly at the man who had engineered his downfall and said something that Korean historical records preserved, almost word for word, because it stunned everyone who heard it. He said, in essence, that his superior was demanding he shoulder the entire blame for the disaster, but that his superior was wrong to do so. He reminded the court that this same man had repeatedly, deliberately refused every one of his urgent requests for reinforcement. The defeat, he said plainly, was not a result of his own negligence, but was in large part his superior's fault, and therefore, he said, it was not himself, but the man accusing him who should be held responsible. The court was stunned into silence. Many of the officials present already knew Yi Sun-sin's reputation for honesty, and his calm, unflinching testimony carried real weight in the room. He was allowed to live, but he was stripped of every rank he had ever earned and sent back into the army as a common enlisted soldier. No officer status at all, starting again from the very bottom, as though he had never taken the military examination in his life. He was sent right back to the northern border. And once again, with no title, no rank, nothing but the uniform of an ordinary soldier, he fought the raiding tribes with the same distinction he always had. By 1588, after all of it, the broken leg, the corrupt superiors, the false accusations, the torture, the repeated demotions, Yi Sun-sin actually requested to be allowed to retire from the military entirely. Sit with that for a second. This is the man who is, within just a few short years, going to save his entire country. And at this exact point in his life, he was tired enough and had been burned badly enough that he wanted out. 22 years of being punished for excellence. 22 years of doing everything correctly and watching corrupt, well-connected men rise past him anyway. If this story ended here, Yi Sun-sin would be remembered, if he were remembered at all, as a tragic footnote. A genuinely good man, quietly ground down by a broken system, until there was nothing left of his career but bitterness. But the story does not end here, because there was one person in all of Korea who had been quietly watching this entire time, and he was not going to let Yi Sun-sin simply walk away. His name was Ryu Seong-ryong. Ryu and Yi Sun-sin had grown up together as boys in Seoul, playing at mock battles together as children, long before either of them had any idea what their futures actually held. But somewhere along the way, their two paths had split completely. While Yi Sun-sin spent 2 decades absorbing demotion after demotion and false accusation after false accusation in the military, Ryu had climbed steadily through the Confucian civil service, the very path Yi Sun-sin's own family had once wanted for him, eventually rising to become nothing less than the Prime Minister of Korea. Here's something the official court records rarely announced out loud, but that becomes unmistakably clear if you trace Yi Sun-sin's career closely. Ryu's quiet influence is very likely the reason Yi Sun-sin survived some of the darkest moments of his life at all. Again and again, whenever jealous officials moved against him, someone with real power in the capital seems to have been working behind the scenes to keep a door open that should have been slammed shut for good. By the late 1580s, Ryu Seong-ryong had grown deeply worried about something most of the Korean court refused to take seriously. reports were arriving of a newly unified Japan under a fierce, ambitious new ruler named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man who had somehow ended a century of civil war and now commanded the largest army most of Asia had ever seen. Ryu suspected, correctly, that Japan's ambitions were not going to stop at its own coastline. Korea was going to need its very best military minds ready, and ready soon, and Ryu knew exactly who that needed to be. He used his position and his influence to secure Yi Sun-sin a naval appointment in southwestern Korea, and made sure he rose through the ranks there quickly, far more quickly than the normal glacial pace of promotion would have allowed. By 1591, Yi Sun-sin, the same man who had been stripped of rank and forced into the ranks as a common soldier just a few years earlier, was the naval commander for an entire province. 22 years of injustice, and in the end, it came down to this: one loyal friend in exactly the right position of power, who remembered who Yi Sun-sin really was, and who refused to let a broken system waste him. This is where Yi Sun-sin's real story begins. Yi Sun-sin took command of the left Jeolla naval garrison in 1591, and what he found waiting for him there was not encouraging. A fleet in disrepair, undertrained crews, supplies running low. And though almost nobody else in Korea seemed to sense it yet, almost no time left to fix any of it. He didn't waste a single day. He drilled his sailors relentlessly, far harder than they were used to. He oversaw repairs to fortifications along the coast. He stockpiled ammunition and supplies as though he already knew a siege was coming. And this detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. He personally studied the local waters, the tides, the currents, the hidden channels and narrow straits along the southern coastline that most commanders would never have bothered to learn in detail. That knowledge was about to become the single greatest weapon in his entire arsenal. And alongside all of it, he commissioned something new, a warship unlike anything Korea had built before, one that he personally helped design and refine. The turtle ship, Jill. The turtle ship got its name from its armored, spiked roof, a covering specifically designed to make it nearly impossible for enemy soldiers to do the one thing Japanese naval tactics relied on most: boarding an enemy vessel and fighting it out hand-to-hand with swords. Spikes across the roof turned that entire strategy into a death sentence for anyone who tried it. At the front of the ship sat a carved dragon's head, and that dragon's head could do two very different, very frightening things. It could serve as a cannon, firing straight ahead into an enemy hull, or it could billow out thick, choking smoke, disorienting enemy crews who had never seen anything remotely like it before. Japan's entire naval strategy at this time was built almost entirely around getting close enough to grapple an enemy ship and fight it out blade to blade, the exact tactics that had won 100 years of Japanese civil war on land and at sea. The turtle ship was engineered, quite deliberately, to make that single tactic completely useless. Yi Sun-sin was still finishing this preparation. The turtle ships weren't even fully in active service yet, when the moment Ryu Seong-ryong had feared for years finally arrived, faster and louder than anyone in Korea was ready for. April 1592. Sentries stationed along Korea's southeastern coast began spotting ships out on the horizon, then dozens of ships, then hundreds, an enormous fleet, flying sails no one in Korea recognized, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with trade. Word spread fast along the coast. The Japanese were coming. Here's the part of this story that's genuinely painful to tell, because it isn't a story of Korea being simply overpowered. It's a story of Korea refusing, right up until the last possible moment, to believe what was right in front of its eyes. Local commanders looked out at that approaching fleet, and instead of sounding the alarm immediately, tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a trade mission. Maybe, and this genuinely was floated as a serious possibility, it was a large tribute fleet, sent to formally apologize for how rude Japan's ambassadors had recently been. So the local commanders did nothing. The ships began docking at the port city of Busan. Fully armored soldiers, prepared for war, began pouring off the decks by the hundreds, and still nothing. By nightfall, roughly 300 ships carrying an armed Japanese invasion force had landed on Korean soil. A foreign army now stood inside Korea's borders, and Korea's own navy, over 100 heavy warships sitting anchored and ready nearby, had not sent out so much as a single vessel to scout what was actually happening. If they had sent even one ship to look closer, they would have discovered something that mattered enormously. This particular Japanese commander had actually acted against his own orders, racing ahead of the rest of the invasion fleet out of sheer eagerness to be the first to set foot on Korean soil. Most of those hundreds of ships weren't warships at all. They were unarmed transports, utterly defenseless against Korea's actual fleet of war galleys. But nobody checked, and by the time anyone understood what had actually happened, the moment to stop it had already slipped away completely. The Japanese army advanced with terrifying, almost unbelievable speed, crushing Korean resistance city after city. Within a single month, Japanese forces had pushed 200 miles inland and captured Seoul itself, the capital of the entire kingdom. Korean resistance had all but collapsed, and in one final, shameful act of panic, local naval commanders scuttled their own fleets rather than risk facing the invaders. 100 Korean warships destroyed by their own side, without a single shot ever fired at the actual enemy. Here's why this detail matters more than almost any other fact in this entire war. Japan had just built arguably the single most fearsome land army anywhere in Asia. A century of civil war had made its soldiers hardened, its tactics ruthless and effective, its firearms modern and mass-produced. But that same century of land warfare meant Japan had never needed to build a navy capable of truly competing on open water. Korea, meanwhile, had spent 200 years dealing with coastal pirates and raiders, and almost by accident, in the process of building defenses against them, had developed something Japan simply hadn't: genuinely superior naval cannon. Japan had built the better army in Asia. Korea, almost without realizing it, had built the better navy. And right now, there was exactly one Korean commander fully prepared to use it. Desperate commanders near Busan sent word asking for Yi Sun-sin's help. Yi Sun-sin set out with all 24 ships under his direct command, sending word ahead to other local commanders to rendezvous with him at sea. He sailed under cover of darkness so that his fleet's movements wouldn't be spotted by enemy scouts along the coast. By the time the scattered Korean forces finally met up, they had scraped together 45 warships, along with a handful of commandeered fishing boats pressed into service. This was Yi Sun-sin's first naval battle of his entire life. He had never before commanded a fleet in real combat. He had a plan anyway. He would strike the Japanese while they sat anchored in harbor during the chaos of a raid on a nearby town. Catching them at their single most vulnerable moment, crews scattered ashore, looting, ships left virtually undefended on the water. At the harbor of Okpo, Yi Sun-sin's scouts found 50 Japanese vessels tied up at anchor, their crews away in the town. The Korean fleet descended on them without a single moment of warning. The roar of Korean cannon was the very first sign the Japanese had that anything had gone wrong. Yi Sun-sin's ships tore into the enemy vessels, salvo after salvo tearing through the light, thin wood of Japanese hulls, far more fragile than Korea's sturdier warships. Japanese sailors began throwing their weapons and armor overboard, diving into the water, swimming desperately for shore. By nightfall, 26 Japanese ships rested at the bottom of the harbor. Korean losses: 1 sailor, wounded, not killed. That staggering, lopsided outcome, 26 enemy ships destroyed against a single Korean injury, wasn't a fluke of good luck. It was the very first sign of a pattern that would define Yi Sun-sin's entire naval career from here to the end of the war. He almost never lost a ship, and he almost never lost more than a small handful of men, no matter how outnumbered his fleet was. Yi Sun-sin pulled his fleet back out toward open water, wary of falling into exactly the kind of trap he'd just sprung on the enemy himself. But as they withdrew, an outlying ship spotted 5 more Japanese warships nearby. Yi Sun-sin's fleet fell on them immediately. Only 1 enemy vessel managed to escape. Then new reports arrived. 13 more Japanese ships spotted near Chinhae. When those crews caught sight of Yi Sun-sin's fleet closing in, they simply abandoned their ships where they sat and fled on foot into the mountains, rather than risk a fight. 43 Japanese ships destroyed in total, not a single Korean vessel lost. Yi Sun-sin was promoted to command of the entire southern navy for his actions at Okpo. But something else happened there that would stay lodged in his memory for the rest of the war. The sight of Japanese soldiers slaughtering Korean civilians during that same raid, an image that hardened something inside him into pure, unshakable resolve. From this point forward, this was no longer simply a military campaign to Yi Sun-sin. It was the defense of his people, one village at a time. Okpo was only the beginning. Over the following months, Yi Sun-sin's reputation grew battle by battle, and he was elevated to overall command of Korea's southern naval forces. The Battle of Sacheon marked the first time the turtle ship saw real combat. Its armored, spiked hull performed exactly as devastatingly as Yi Sun-sin had designed it to. Japanese boarding parties found themselves with no possible way to grapple onto or climb aboard a ship engineered from the very start to reject them. The Battle of Dangpo followed soon afterward, another decisive Korean victory that further crippled Japanese naval strength along the southern coastline. But it was the next battle that would become the crown jewel of Yi Sun-sin's entire naval career, the one still studied by naval historians today. The Battle of Hansan Island, 1592. By this point in the war, the Japanese fleet knew Yi Sun-sin's reputation, and knew better than to simply sail into open water and hand him another Okpo. So Yi Sun-sin gave them exactly what they thought they wanted to see. He staged a feigned retreat, pulling his ships back as if withdrawing out of weakness or fear, deliberately luring the much larger Japanese fleet out of the safety of a protected harbor and into open water, where Yi Sun-sin's own ships would have far more room to maneuver freely. The Japanese fleet took the bait completely. Once they were fully committed in open water, Yi Sun-sin's ships turned, not into a simple straight line of battle, but into a formation shaped like a crane's outstretched wings, sweeping around both flanks of the Japanese fleet simultaneously. Ships positioned along either edge of that formation could bring their cannon to bear on the enemy from multiple directions at once, while the Japanese found themselves boxed in from three sides, unable to use their superior numbers effectively at all. A Japanese fleet nearly twice the size of Yi Sun-sin's own was annihilated. The Battle of Hansan Island is still studied today in naval academies around the world as one of history's truly great naval victories, not simply because Korea won, but specifically because of the tactical brilliance of the crane wing formation, which turned what should have been a crushing numerical disadvantage into a devastating ambush. It crippled Japan's ability to resupply its invasion force by sea, choking off the flow of soldiers, weapons, and food that the army occupying Korea desperately needed to keep fighting. Every single battle Yi Sun-sin fought hammered home the same brutal truth. On land, Japan was nearly unstoppable. At sea, Yi Sun-sin was. It would be easy, after hearing victory after victory after victory, to start thinking of Yi Sun-sin as something more than human, a legend instead of a real breathing person. But we don't have to guess what Yi Sun-sin actually thought and felt during all of this, because remarkably, he told us himself. Almost every single day of this war, Yi Sun-sin wrote in a diary. Historians call it the Nanjung Ilgi, a diary from the midst of war, and astonishingly, much of it survives to this day in his own handwriting. And what it reveals isn't a legend at all. It's a tired, grieving, deeply dutiful man. He wrote about exhaustion after long, grinding campaigns. He wrote about grief for soldiers under his command who never made it home. Again and again, with visible, heavy worry, he wrote about his aging mother, far away and out of reach, whom he could rarely visit and constantly feared he might never see again before this war finally ended. He almost never wrote about glory. He wrote about duty, the weight of carrying it, the loneliness of carrying it, the cost of carrying it, when so few of the people around him seemed to be carrying their fair share. Because we have Yi Sun-sin's actual handwritten diary, almost everything we know about his private thoughts during this war doesn't come from legend, guesswork, or stories passed down over centuries. It comes from his own words, often written just hours after a battle, or after a long, exhausting day's march. Stop and sit with that for a second. Every single victory you've just heard about, Okpo, Sacheon, Dangpo, Hansan Island, happened alongside a man who, in the quiet hours afterward, was privately worrying about his mother's health and mourning fallen soldiers by name in a notebook nobody else was ever meant to read. That's not what makes Yi Sun-sin less impressive. That's exactly what makes him real. And it matters that you understand that man clearly. because the very government he was giving everything he had to protect was about to betray him one more time. By 1597, Yi Sun-sin's unbroken string of victories had made him one of the most celebrated men in all of Korea. It had also made him a target. Court rivals, resentful of his growing fame and influence, worked together with a Japanese scheme involving a planted double agent to convince King Seonjo of something entirely false, that Yi Sun-sin was disloyal, that he was refusing direct orders out of arrogance, and that his unwillingness to sail his fleet into a certain location wasn't caution, it was defiance. In reality, Yi Sun-sin had correctly identified that location as an obvious trap laid by the enemy. The king didn't see it that way. The king believed the lie. Yi Sun-sin, the man who had not lost a single naval battle in this entire war, was arrested, tortured, nearly executed outright. He survived only because allies still remaining at court intervened desperately on his behalf, buying him a life he had already, in every practical sense, earned many times over. He was once again stripped of every rank he held and forced back into service as a common soldier. No title, no command, as if none of it, Okpo, Sacheon, Dangpo, Hansan Island, had ever happened at all. And here is the devastating consequence of that single decision. With Yi Sun-sin removed from command, control of the rebuilt Korean Navy passed to a man named Won-gyun. Won-gyun led that fleet into the Battle of Chilcholyang and lost almost the entire navy year. Yi Sun-sin had spent years of his life building, ship by ship, in a single catastrophic afternoon. While all of this unfolded, personal tragedy struck Yi Sun-sin as well. His mother, the same woman his diary shows him worrying over for years, letter after letter, entry after entry, died while he was in custody, unable to reach her side. And later in the war, Yi Sun-sin would also lose his own son. We won't dwell on the painful details of that loss here. It deserves to be treated with the gravity and care it's owed, not turned into a plot point for shock value. But it matters enormously that you understand this. Even while Yi Sun-sin was single-handedly holding together Korea's entire defense, grief was walking alongside him the whole time. He carried it, and he kept going anyway. The navy he built was gone. His mother was gone. He had now been tortured by his own government for the second time in his life, and Korea's entire southern coastline now lay wide open to a renewed, furious Japanese invasion. This is the lowest point in this entire story, and it is exactly the moment when Yi Sun-sin was reinstated. King Seonjo, with the Korean navy now in ruins, and with genuinely no one else left he could turn to, reinstated Yi Sun-sin as commander. What Yi Sun-sin inherited was almost nothing. 12 ships, perhaps 13. Historians differ slightly on the exact number, which is worth saying honestly, rather than pretending every figure from 400 years ago is perfectly documented. Whatever the precise count, it was a fraction of what Japan was now preparing to throw against Korea's coastline. Some voices at court, looking at those numbers, suggested Korea simply abandon its navy altogether and pour every remaining resource into land defenses instead. It would have been the easier choice, the safer-sounding choice, the choice that asked nothing impossible of anyone. Yi Sun-sin refused. He personally inspected every single ship he had left. He prepared what little remained of his fleet with the same relentless discipline he had once poured into a forgotten fort on the northern border 25 years earlier. And when the royal court questioned whether maintaining a navy at all was even worth the effort anymore, Yi Sun-sin sent back a message that Korean history has remembered, word for over 400 years. He told the king that he still had ships enough to fight. 12 ships, against a fleet that would soon number over 300. That single message is what brings us back to the exact place this story began. The dark, churning water of Myeongyang Strait, the night before an impossible battle. The Japanese fleet approaching Myeongyang Strait numbered well over 130 warships, the spearhead of a larger invasion force topping 300 vessels in total. Yi Sun-sin had 12, perhaps 13. But Yi Sun-sin had something no Japanese commander could ever bring with them into this fight. Decades spent quietly studying these exact waters, long before anyone believed he would need to. Myeongyang Strait is narrow, so narrow that Japan's overwhelming numbers would be almost worthless there, because only a limited number of ships could physically fit through the channel at once to actually engage. And the tides in that strait don't gently ebb and flow the way tides usually do. They violently reverse direction, transforming the entire channel into a raging, unpredictable current, strong enough to become a weapon in the hands of whoever understood it. Yi Sun-sin positioned his ships to fight inside that bottleneck, exactly where Japan's crushing numerical advantage would count for almost nothing. Imagine you are there. You're standing on the deck of a Korean warship, deep inside Myeongyang Strait. The water beneath the hull isn't calm sea. It's roaring, churning, reversing direction with enough force to spin a heavy ship sideways if the helmsman loses his focus for even a second. Ahead of you, more Japanese warships than you can possibly count are pressing forward into the strait, straining to force their way through. Every other captain in the Korean fleet is visibly terrified. Some hold back, unwilling to commit their ship to what looks, from where they're sitting, like certain destruction. For a long, agonizing stretch of the battle, it is Yi Sun-sin's flagship alone, just one single ship, standing against the entire advancing Japanese line, holding position, buying time, refusing to break no matter what comes at it. Imagine watching that. Imagine watching your admiral's one ship hold that line completely by itself, wave after wave crashing against it and not moving. Imagine the exact moment the other captains finally understand what they're looking at. If he isn't running, why are we? One by one, the rest of the Korean fleet pushed forward to join him. And then the tide itself turned, literally, physically turned. The violent tidal reversal Yi Sun-sin had studied for years finally began working against the Japanese ships now crowded into that narrow channel, throwing their entire formation into chaos, hulls colliding into each other, their advance breaking apart from the inside without a single Korean cannon needing to fire another shot. By the end of the battle, against odds of roughly 10-1, the Korean fleet had won. The Battle of Myeongyang is still considered one of the most remarkable naval victories in all of recorded world history. Not because Korea had superior firepower or superior numbers, because it plainly did not, but because one commander's decades of quietly studying his own coastline turned the geography itself into an unbeatable weapon. 12 ships had held a line that an entire nation's fear said they had no business holding. Korea's coast and Korea itself had been saved from immediate collapse. But the war was not over yet, and the final, most emotional chapter of Yi Sun-sin's life was about to begin. In 1598, something happened that reshaped the entire remaining course of the war. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who had dreamed of building a vast Asian empire radiating outward from Japan, died. Hideyoshi had been holding Japan's war effort in Korea together almost entirely through the sheer force of his own personal will. The moment he was gone, the council of leaders now running Japan looked at one another and quietly agreed. None of them particularly wanted to keep fighting a war in Korea that their late leader had started and that had never truly belonged to any of them. They began quietly arranging to withdraw Japanese forces as safely and quickly as they could negotiate. But Korea was not eager for a quiet, unanswered peace. Hundreds of thousands of Korean civilians had been slaughtered over the years of this invasion, and there was little appetite among Korea's leadership, or Yi Sun-sin himself, to simply let Japan's remaining forces sail home unchallenged. So Yi Sun-sin, now coordinating closely with an allied Chinese navy, worked to trap Japan's remaining forces at one of their last strongholds, the port of Suncheon. The Chinese army closed in by land, while the combined Korean and Chinese fleets blockaded the port entirely by sea. Seeing no way out, the Japanese commander at Suncheon tried bribery, attempting to buy his fleet's passage through the blockade. Every time it looked as though he might succeed in bribing part of the Chinese contingent, Yi Sun-sin shamed them back into holding their line. With no path left to a peaceful retreat, the Japanese commander made one final plan. He sent a small messenger boat slipping quietly through enemy lines, calling for another major Japanese garrison to bring every ship it had and force a breakout together, all at once. Yi Sun-sin learned of the plan, and he knew exactly what needed to happen next. The night of November 18th, bleeding into the early hours of November 19th, 1598. The sun has long since fallen, and the water has faded from blue into a deep, featureless black. Yi Sun-sin ordered his forces to slip quietly away from the blockade under cover of darkness. moving to intercept the reinforcing Japanese fleet before it could ever reach Suncheon in the waters of the Noryang Strait. Near 2 in the morning, the combined Korean and Chinese fleet fell upon the resting Japanese ships. At first, it was chaos, cannon fire tearing across black water in the middle of the night, flashes of orange light the only warning anyone had. But the Japanese, though caught completely off guard, still commanded roughly 500 ships against a combined Allied force of only around 150, and they were fighting now with the desperation of men who understood that losing here might mean never seeing their homeland again. The Allied fleet had 2 real advantages though. Once again, the battle was unfolding inside a strait too narrow for Japan's full numbers to be brought to bear all at once, and a great many of the Japanese vessels were transports, useful for carrying troops and for boarding actions, but never built for a genuine ship-to-ship fight. In desperation, the Japanese fleet drove forward straight through withering cannon fire. Then something went badly wrong on the Allied side. The Chinese commander, unfamiliar with the kind of long-range, disciplined naval warfare Yi Sun-sin had spent years perfecting, charged his ship directly into close combat with the Japanese fleet, and found himself completely surrounded. Dozens of Japanese ships closed in around the Chinese flagship, tightening like a noose. Yi Sun-sin ordered his own ship into the fight to rescue him. He was committed now, fully and irreversibly. What followed would be exactly the kind of close, brutal, hand-to-hand combat Yi Sun-sin had spent his entire naval career trying to avoid. The very fighting style his cannons and formations had been designed from the start to prevent, now completely unavoidable. Unarmed Korean sailors, out of every other option, began throwing bundles of burning sticks down onto enemy decks at close range, anything to slow the boarding parties. As Yi Sun-sin's ship broke through the chaos toward the trapped Chinese flagship, he spotted 3 Japanese commanders standing on the deck of a nearby vessel, directing the assault against his ally. Yi Sun-sin drew his bow and fired. One of the Japanese commanders fell. For just a moment, there was almost silence in the middle of the battle, everyone turning at once to see exactly where that single arrow had come from. Then a Japanese officer shook off his shock and shouted a single order across the water. "It's Yi Sun-sin! All ships, attack him!" Every Japanese vessel within reach turned at once to converge on his flagship. But that gave the Chinese commander his own opening. His ships broke free and tore into the vessels now hunting Yi Sun-sin. Soon the fighting had shifted directly onto the deck of the Chinese flagship itself. Chinese blades meeting Japanese swords in close, desperate combat. In the end, the boarding parties were repelled, but men from both sides lay dead on that deck by the time it was over. As dawn began to bring light back to the water, it became painfully clear just how badly the Japanese fleet had been broken. They tried to flee. These were the men who had come to his country, who had burned his people's homes and slaughtered thousands upon thousands of his countrymen, who had cost him his mother, his son, and 22 years of his own life through a corrupt system that had let this entire war happen in the first place. He would not let them simply sail home now as though none of it had happened. He grabbed the mallet from his own ship's drummer and began beating the war drum himself, urging his fleet forward, faster, harder, relentless. The drumbeat pushed the entire fleet onward, its rhythm hounding the fleeing Japanese ships, closing the gap ship by ship. Cannon roared. Arquebuses answered. Ship after ship was caught by the pursuing fleet, driven forward entirely by the sound of a single relentless drum. Then, for just an instant, the drum faltered. Seen by no one except his son, his nephew, and one loyal servant standing nearby, Yi Sun-sin had been struck by a stray arquebus round. They rushed to him as he slumped against the drum, desperate to help, begging to know what they could possibly do. With what strength he had left, Yi Sun-sin gave them his final order. He told them the war was about to be won, and he told them, "Keep beating the drum. Do not let anyone else know that I have died." His son picked up the mallet, and the drumbeat continued without a single misstep. Dressed in Yi Sun-sin's own armor, his son and his nephew took his place at the command post. For the remaining hours of the battle, they were Yi Sun-sin, issuing orders exactly as he would have, commanding with every ounce of skill they had absorbed from watching him for years. Not one of his officers ever realized their admiral had fallen. Near the very close of the battle, the Chinese flagship was surrounded once again. Yi Sun-sin's son ordered his ship straight into the thick of it, breaking the encirclement, helping the Chinese commander escape, exactly the way Yi Sun-sin himself would have done without a second thought. The fighting was fierce, but it was nearly finished. As the day drew to a close, the Chinese admiral sailed his ship toward what he believed was Yi Sun-sin's, calling out across the water to thank him for the rescue, inviting him to celebrate their victory together. He was met by Yi Sun-sin's son instead. The moment he understood what had happened, the Chinese admiral threw himself to the deck 3 separate times, wailing, crying out that even in death, Yi Sun-sin had saved his life. Thousands of people turned out to watch as Yi Sun-sin's body was carried home to his small village. People who had never once met him in life lined the roads and wept openly for a man they only knew through everything he had quietly done for them. The Chinese admiral he had died rescuing wrote a eulogy in his honor. Even the royal court, the very court that had tortured him twice, stripped him of every rank he ever earned, not once but 3 times, and let a corrupt system nearly waste his entire life before it was too late, tried, far too late, to make some kind of recompense. He was given a posthumous title that has followed his name in Korea for over 400 years, the Martial Lord of Loyalty. 23 battles against the Japanese Navy over the course of this entire war. 23 victories, not a single defeat. The exact numbers of ships and casualties in some of these battles vary slightly depending on which historical source you consult. A reminder that even a story this thoroughly documented still has small edges where popular legend runs slightly ahead of the historical record. But the shape of this story, the demotions, the torture, the impossible victories, and the final battle is not legend, it is history, and much of it survives in Yi Sun. Here is what's easy to miss in a story full of cannon fire and turtle ships and impossible odds. The most important battles in Yi Sun-sin's life weren't fought at sea at all. They were fought in a muddy exam field with a shattered leg and a splint made from a willow tree, in a corrupt military academy where simply doing the right thing got him quietly sent away, in a torture chamber where he refused to lie about who was really responsible for a defeat that was never his fault, across 22 long years where nobody was rewarding him for being excellent at his job. And he kept being excellent at it anyway, with no promise that anyone would ever notice. That's the part of this story worth carrying with you long after the battles fade. Not just that he won 23 naval battles in a row, remarkable as that is on its own. It's that he was already ready, drilled, prepared, quietly studying the tides, quietly rebuilding forgotten forts during all the years when nobody believed the danger was actually coming. Long before anyone else could see the storm gathering on the horizon, Yi Sun-sin was already preparing for it, with nothing to gain from the effort and no one clapping for him along the way. And in the very end, in his last living moments, he made one final choice that tells you everything you need to know about who he truly was. He didn't ask his son to carry news of his death to the fleet. He didn't ask to be remembered, or thanked, or mourned in that moment, or to make sure everyone understood exactly what he had sacrificed. He asked his son to keep beating the drum, to let the battle keep moving forward without him, to make absolutely certain his country won, even if that meant no one would know for hours that the man leading them to victory was already gone. That is what it looks like to lead so completely and to love your people so fully that you would rather quietly disappear from your own story than risk losing the fight you were already winning. Yi Sun-sin never asked to be remembered. He simply made sure that Korea would still be there to remember anything at all